and we're going to continue to talk about gender roles with women in the 1920s. Through the 19th Amendment, or though the 19th Amendment was passed, the women's lives did not change as much as they had hoped. The 19th Amendment being women's suffrage, and many women adopted the political beliefs of their husbands, as they were still kind of told to not think too freely for themselves. Most middle-class women stayed home as homemakers and mothers. The washing machine, vacuum cleaners helped make homemakers' lives easier, but they were still expected to stay at home. When women did work, they were fairly limited in their jobs as far as what they were allowed to do. Clerks, nurses, teachers. They were often paid less than men. That was really something that almost, you could say, point to, still happens today, depending on the industry that they're in. A notable change was the reaction against sexual restrictions. Many were reading the discoveries and viewpoints of Sigmund Freud, and he stressed that mental illness could actually be tied to sexual repression, meaning you do not allow your sexual thoughts to come to fruition. Therefore, many were treating sex like it was a new invention of this age, and as we said before, the invention of the car probably did not help that. Movies, music, automobiles, and dancing all seem to encourage promiscuity, which basically means having sex. Margaret Sanger helped people to more readily accept the use of birth control for women, which allows them to decide when they do and when they do not want to have a child. Some women gained the nickname flappers. They dressed with skirts that would end at the knee. They'd cut their hair shorter and would smoke and drink. Many conservatives were very uncomfortable with this. Most of this movement would exist in the cities. Women, once married, were expected to get rid of the flapper look and kind of settle down. But flappers kind of came to describe women during this age. Divorce. Many women asked legislators to change the divorce laws in order to give women more rights and to help them get out of abusive relationships. Divorces moved from 1/8 of the population to 1/6 by the end of the decade. So basically saying 1 out of 8 marriages or 1 out of 6 marriages. You have to understand that back then you didn't get divorced. It was kind of seen as a bad thing. You stayed with your marriage relationship. Education. More governments enacted compulsory education laws, meaning they had to go to school. And a high school education was now the goal of the American public, a full high school education. And by the end of the 1920s, the number of high school graduates had doubled to over 25% of the school-age young adults. So education is going to become more popular. As far as literature, many were becoming discontent with the conservative, religious, and capitalistic views of the country. By conservative, we mean like the religious sector, like the no drinking, no smoking, no sex sector of the country. And a new group known as the Lost Generation were writers who went after many of the things the general public encouraged. Novels from F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and Sinclair Lewis expressed delusionment of the idealism of the day, meaning they didn't agree with how everybody ideally wanted to see America act a certain way. Many of them left the country, and they went after the materialism and the business-oriented culture, and then many of them left the country and went to Europe, and others went to a life of alcohol and drug abuse to get their highs and to draw themselves away from society. But I would definitely know those names. This is where you get like books like The Great Gatsby, A Farewell to Arms, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This Side of Paradise is another book by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So maybe you want to be familiar with some of those. Art and architecture. Many products, buildings, appliances, trains had more aesthetic appeal. The Art Deco style dominated the skyscrapers. If you want to look up a picture of the Empire State Building, this was kind of like the modern, simplistic, and very visually appealing, just classic big city look. Painters such as Edward Hopper were inspired by architecture of American cities and the loneliness and isolation of urban life. Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton celebrated the rural people and their life in the heartland. Why am I giving you these people's names? Not that you would have to know every single one of them, but they might point to, if you see their name on like a DBQ, that way you would know who these individuals are, but they won't be used for my tests. The Harlem Renaissance. By the 1930s, almost 20% of African Americans lived in the North. Though still facing discrimination, their standard of living was still on the rise. A large community of African Americans developed in the Harlem area of New York City, which is a borough of New York City. And this area became famous for their concentration of artists, musicians, actors, and writers. Other African Americans not necessarily associated with Harlem that made an impact were Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Both were jazz musicians. Louis Armstrong's that guy that plays the trumpet and, When You're Smiling, that song, and What a Wonderful World. He kind of has like a, when I think to myself, that guy. So hopefully you enjoyed that. And Duke Ellington played the piano. Both these guys were jazz musicians. African Americans became very popular within that. Marcus Garvey brought the United Negro Improvement Association to Harlem. He advocated individual and racial pride from African Americans and developed political ideas of black nationalism. He came up with an idea to take all African Americans back to Africa. He invested in a steamship company to help the matter. Eventually, he was caught on fraud where he stole people's money. He was jailed and eventually deported back to his home, Jamaica. And though many black leaders did not agree with his means, they did agree with his ideas that maybe a best suited situation for African Americans was to live separate than that from whites. Letter H, conflict. It seemed as if there were growing dissent within the culture. Modernists believed in the advancement of the role of women, social gospel movement, and got many Christians to think more critically about their faith, particularly evolution. The opposite would have been fundamentalists who preached the Bible should be taken literally and creation was a fact. The fundamentalists would have been seen as moralists as well. Some of those fundamentalists would be heard on the radio preaching. Maybe you've heard of Billy Sunday, D.L. Moody would have been his Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago would have been part of this time period as well. The Scopes monkey trial happens, and John Scopes was a teacher from Tennessee who was persuaded by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to teach evolution as fact in his school. Since this was against the law in Tennessee, he was jailed and put on trial. Now, he knew this, and he was willing to take that risk. They said they would pay his fine and help him get out of this if they could. And Scopes was defended by a famous lawyer, Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow is going to be the guy that's going to try to defend John Scopes and his ability to teach creation or not teach creation in the public schools. William Jennings Bryan was the prosecution lawyer. Yes, he is still alive. And the nation followed this case in the news big time. Now, Scopes lost, but the steps to taking creationism out of the schools were being taken. If you remember from ninth grade, this is the case where the judge was a traveling evangelist, and above his head he had a huge banner at the courtroom saying, "Read your Bible." John Scopes really didn't have a chance. Even though he had one of the best lawyers of all time on his side, it still didn't matter. Prohibition, for years, many have been trying to take alcohol out of the country. Congress finally passed the 18th Amendment in 1919 and the Volstead Act to enforce the manufacturing, sale, and transportation of alcohol, basically saying you were not allowed to do any of those things. You could still actually get it from a doctor, but it'd have to be prescribed, and it wasn't like they were just giving it all the time. The law did not stop people from breaking the law. People became very creative, speakeasies, bootlegs, smuggling, in order to try to get some of the alcohol. Many officials were paid to look the other way. Even the White House is known for serving alcohol during this time. Crime was often associated with the Prohibition. Chicago became an organized crime stronghold led by Al Capone, and this expanded in other illegal activities such as gambling, prostitution, and drugs. Though the Republicans seemed to support the 18th Amendment right at first, over time, the growing concerns of crime dominated the conversation. Prohibition was also not helping the economy. By the time the Depression hit, Prohibition would have to be overturned to see if you could get people back to work and get people spending money. In theory, Prohibition seemed like a really good idea, but the long-lasting ramifications for our economy was not worth it. Number 5, nativism. In World War I, World War I slowed the flow of immigrants to the U.S. The post-war, immigration grew again and again. Many of the immigrants were coming from areas that were parts of the new immigration. This would be like Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This created a rise in fears against the immigrants: jobs, religion, economic systems, quota laws. In 1921, we limited immigration to 3% of the number of born persons from a given nation, counted in the 1910 census. So let me give you an example. What that would be is if you had a country that had, we had 100,000 people that came into our country in 1910, then what we would do is we'd take 3% of that moving forward. In 1924, we set quotas of 2% based on the census of 1890 before arrival of most of the new immigrants. Again, we are trying to get rid of people coming into our country. These laws chiefly restricted those groups that many nativists considered undesirables. By 1927, the quota for all Asians, Eastern, and Southern Europeans had been limited to 150,000 per year, with all Japanese immigrants being barred from entering our country. The tradition of unlimited U.S. immigration had ended under these quota laws. Canadians and Latin Americans were exempt, and almost 500,000 Mexicans migrated to the Southwest in the 1920s. Next, let's talk about Sacco and Vanzetti. Those who were against nativism and racism were not large in number, but were loud in voice. Both these individuals were accused of robbery and murder in Massachusetts at a bank roll facility where people picked up their checks. And though the evidence against them was scarce, people focused on the fact that they were immigrants and they were associated with anarchy. Both men were eventually convicted and executed. Now, later on evidence, it sounds like, if I remember correctly, I think Sacco was innocent and Vanzetti was guilty. But nonetheless, at the time, we didn't really have that great of information, but we wanted to kind of make them an example. So it just kind of showed how badly people didn't trust people during this time period. The KKK. Nativism in the most extreme form was founded by the KKK. The original Klan started in the late 1800s, was based in the South. It was based out of Tennessee. The new Klan members were focused in the Midwest. You guys can think back to Forrest Gump, and the actual leader of the KKK was Nathan Bedford Forrest. So that part is kind of true, even though Forrest Gump is a make-believe story. But now the focus of the Klan is in the Midwest, Indiana, lower Michigan. A lot of new members were attracted to the Klan because of silent film Birth of a Nation, in which KKK was portrayed as heroes during the Reconstruction era. The new members didn't only focus their hatred on blacks, but also Jews, Catholics, immigrants, and communists. Their tactics included burning crosses, tar and feathering, hanging people, whipping, and beating people. They also developed strong political alliances to influence politics. They even marched in Washington to have their voice heard. They have the right to assemble. They didn't do it violently, but eventually the army's going to have to step in and say, yeah, you guys can't do that because it's just too risky. Once one of their main leaders was convicted of murder, their influence and membership declined rapidly. They will grow in popularity in the 1950s and 60s again in the civil rights, so it kind of comes in waves, but the KKK. All right, that's it. We'll pick up foreign policy next.